No cartel collapses overnight. It closes in piece by piece. These are the final days of the world's most infamous drug kingpins, Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria. By late 1993, Pablo Escobar was no longer running an empire. He was hiding with a very small inner circle, moving between safe houses in Medellin, cut off from most allies. Years of pressure from the Colombian government, U.S. law enforcement agencies, including the DEA, rival cartels, and vigilante groups, had destroyed his network. His trusted lieutenants were dead, imprisoned, or cooperating with authorities. Money was no longer protection, and loyalty had evaporated. Escobar's final weeks were defined by isolation and routine mistakes. He relied heavily on phone calls to his family, especially his son. Each call created a radio signal that could be triangulated. Colombian security forces had formed a specialized unit known as the Search Block, trained and equipped to track and capture him, with signal interception as its primary tactic. On December 2, 1993, Escobar made a prolonged phone call from a middle-class neighborhood in Medellin. The call lasted long enough for tracking teams to narrow down the exact building. Within minutes, search block units surrounded the house. Escobar and his bodyguard Álvaro de Jesus Agudelo, known as El Limón, attempted to flee by climbing onto the roof and moving across neighboring buildings. He was barefoot and carrying a handgun, indicating he had little time to prepare. The pursuit ended on the rooftop, where gunfire erupted as police closed in. Escobar was hit multiple times, including a fatal shot to the head. Some controversy later emerged over whether the final shot was fired by police or by Escobar himself, who had long claimed he would never be taken alive. Regardless of the source, the outcome was the same. Escobar died at the scene. His death marked the abrupt end of the Medellin cartel. Rivals absorbed territory, and the Colombian drug trade shifted toward more decentralized, less visible networks. The most powerful drug lord in the world spent his final moments not as a kingpin, but as a fugitive exposed by a single phone call. Griselda Blanco Restrepo. After serving nearly 2 decades in U.S. federal prison, Griselda Blanco was deported to Colombia in 2004. By then, her power was gone. The Miami cocaine empire she once controlled had collapsed, several of her sons were dead, and her former allies had either been killed, imprisoned, or moved on. She settled quietly in Medellin, reportedly living under her real name and avoiding public attention. Blanco's final years were deliberately low profile. She lived in a modest neighborhood in the Belén area of Medellin, handled her own errands, and avoided visible security. Age and imprisonment had removed her from the active drug trade, but they had not erased old grudges. During her peak in the 1970s and 1980s, she had ordered dozens, possibly hundreds, of murders. Many of those decisions created enemies who outlived her organization. On September 3, 2012, Blanco went to a butcher shop near her home, following a routine she had repeated many times before. As she exited the shop, 2 men approached on a motorcycle. One dismounted, walked directly toward her, and fired multiple shots at close range. She was killed instantly on the sidewalk. The method of the killing was significant. Motorcycle assassinations were a tactic Blanco herself had popularized during the Miami cocaine wars. The efficiency of the attack, quick approach, close-range shots, immediate escape, suggested a professional hit rather than a spontaneous act. No arrests were made, and the gunmen were never identified. Blanco's death did not trigger retaliation or a power struggle because her organization no longer existed. Amado Carrillo Fuentes. By 1997, Amado Carrillo Fuentes was under sustained pressure from both Mexican and U.S. authorities. As the leader of the Juarez cartel, he had overseen one of the largest drug transportation networks in history, using fleets of commercial aircraft to move cocaine from Colombia into Mexico and onward to the United States. An organization of that magnitude could not remain hidden indefinitely. Surveillance tightened, arrests increased, and rival factions began circling his organization. Rather than flee or fight, Carrillo chose transformation. His plan was to permanently alter his appearance through extensive plastic surgery and assume a new identity. This was not a cosmetic adjustment. It involved full facial reconstruction, liposuction, and other procedures designed to make him unrecognizable to both law enforcement and former associates. Investigators later stated that his intent was to evade authorities and reduce his public profile, though whether he planned to exit the drug trade permanently remains unclear. On July 3, 1997, Carrillo checked into a private hospital in Mexico City under a false name. A team of surgeons began a long, complex operation that lasted several hours. During or immediately after the procedure, Carrillo went into cardiac arrest and died on the operating table. The official cause of death was heart failure related to the surgery. Suspicion followed almost immediately. The delay in identifying the body, combined with the subsequent murder of two surgeons, whose bodies were later found inside oil drums filled with concrete, raised questions about whether Carrillo had truly died. Some speculated that the body belonged to someone else, and that Carrillo had successfully escaped. Mexican authorities later stated that fingerprint analysis confirmed his identity, officially closing the case. Carrillo's death caused immediate instability within the Juarez cartel. Without his centralized control, internal divisions escalated into violent power struggles. The organization fractured, weakening its dominance and accelerating cartel violence across northern Mexico in the years that followed. Gonzalo Rodriguez Gacha. By late 1989, Gacha was no longer a hidden financier within the Medellin cartel. He had become a primary military target of the Colombian state. His involvement in large-scale violence, including financial support for paramilitary groups and links cited by investigators to the assassination of presidential candidate Luis Carlos Galán, triggered an aggressive response from the government. Unlike other cartel leaders who relied on secrecy, Gacha favored open displays of force, which made him easier to identify and track. As pressure intensified, Colombian police and military units began dismantling his security network. Properties were raided, airstrips destroyed, and trusted enforcers killed or arrested. Gacha attempted to relocate repeatedly, moving between rural hideouts along Colombia's Caribbean coast. These hideouts were remote, but they left him with few ways to escape and depended more on armed guards than staying hidden. On December 15, 1989, authorities intercepted intelligence placing Gacha near the town of Tolu. Surveillance aircraft and ground forces converged on the area. When security units closed in, Gacha attempted to flee by vehicle along with his teenage son, Gonzalo Rodriguez Jr., and several bodyguards. The convoy entered open terrain, where it became exposed to aerial tracking and coordinated ground pursuit. A brief but overwhelming firefight followed. Government forces used helicopters, leaving little opportunity for escape or negotiation. Gacha, his son, and multiple members of his security detail were killed at the scene. The confrontation ended within minutes. His final moments reflected the same approach that defined his career: direct confrontation. Gilberto José Rodríguez Orejuela. Orejuela was no longer operating as a fugitive by the mid-1990s. Unlike leaders who relied on violence or intimidation, he had run the Cali cartel through bureaucracy, accountants, and legal fronts. When sustained pressure from Colombian and U.S. authorities dismantled the cartel's structure, his final days were defined by arrest, confinement, and declining health rather than pursuit or gunfire. In 1995, Colombian authorities captured Orejuela after months of coordinated raids against the Cali cartel. He was imprisoned in Colombia, where he initially retained some influence through money and legal appeals. That influence eroded steadily as extradition laws changed and international cooperation increased. In 2004, he was extradited to the United States, removing him permanently from any remaining control over operations or associates. His final years were spent inside the U.S. federal prison system, including medical facilities for his declining health. He suffered from multiple chronic illnesses, including colon cancer, which worsened over time. His lawyers sought compassionate release, arguing that his condition was terminal and that he no longer posed any threat. U.S. courts denied those requests, citing the scale of his crimes and the sentence imposed. Gilberto Orejuela died in custody in 2022 at the age of 83. His death occurred under constant supervision, surrounded by prison staff rather than allies or family. Ramón Eduardo Arellano Felix. Felix was the most visible enforcement leader in the Tijuana cartel. Unlike other cartel bosses who stayed hidden, he moved around openly, carried his own weapons, and depended on fear rather than secrecy for protection. Because he was known as the cartel's main enforcer, Mexican authorities focused heavily on finding and stopping him. In the months leading up to his death, federal police and military units increased patrols and surveillance in tourist areas along Mexico's Pacific coast. Intelligence indicated that Felix continued to attend public events despite the risk, trusting his reflexes and firepower to protect him. This behavior reduced his ability to evade detection and placed him in unpredictable environments. On February 10, 2002, during carnival celebrations in Mazatlan, police identified Felix in a crowded area. Officers attempted to approach him for arrest. Instead of surrendering, Felix drew his weapon and opened fire. His security team immediately joined the confrontation, turning the scene into a brief but intense gun battle surrounded by civilians. Police returned fire. Felix was struck multiple times and collapsed at the scene. Several of his bodyguards were also killed or wounded. The exchange ended quickly, but the public setting amplified its impact, forcing authorities to act rapidly to contain the threat and protect bystanders. Ramon Arellano Felix died exactly as he had lived, armed, aggressive, and unwilling to retreat. His death weakened the Tijuana cartel's enforcement arm and accelerated its decline, as no successor possessed the same combination of violence. Frank Lucas. Lucas's final years looked nothing like his rise. After dominating heroin trafficking in Harlem during the late 1960s and early 1970s, his organization collapsed when federal investigators uncovered his smuggling operation and financial network. Arrests, seizures, and cooperating witnesses dismantled his control over time. Lucas was convicted on federal drug charges and initially sentenced to a 70-year prison term. Facing overwhelming evidence, he chose to cooperate with authorities, though. His testimony helped expose corruption within law enforcement and contributed to cases against other traffickers and corrupt officials. In exchange, his sentence was dramatically reduced to 15 years. This decision ended any remaining influence he had in the drug trade. Former associates viewed him as unreliable, and no criminal organization attempted to rebuild around him. After his release, Lucas lived under periodic federal supervision and stayed out of organized crime. He moved away from Harlem and avoided public attention. Unlike many former traffickers, he did not attempt to re-enter the drug world or leverage his reputation for influence. His later life was marked by financial instability and declining health from old age rather than violence or pursuit. Frank Lucas died in 2019 at the age of 88 from natural causes. He passed away quietly at home, surrounded by family. Arturo Beltrán Leyva. By late 2009, Leyva was under direct, sustained pressure from Mexican authorities. Once a senior figure within the Sinaloa cartel, he broke away and formed his own organization after internal disputes. That split turned him into a priority target. Intelligence sharing between Mexican forces and U.S. agencies narrowed his movement options and exposed his remaining safe houses. Leyva's final days were spent inside a luxury apartment complex in Cuernavaca, chosen for comfort rather than defensibility. The location offered privacy but limited escape routes, and placed him in a dense urban environment. He relied heavily on armed bodyguards and stockpiled weapons instead of mobility or concealment, signaling that he expected confrontation rather than capture. On December 16, 2009, Mexican Navy Special Forces surrounded the building following confirmed intelligence of his presence. When troops attempted to enter, Leyva and his security team resisted immediately. What followed was a prolonged firefight inside the apartment complex, involving automatic weapons and grenades. The engagement lasted several hours and caused extensive damage to the interior. Leyva was killed during the operation along with multiple bodyguards. According to official accounts, he did not surrender, and no negotiation took place. His body was later photographed and publicly shown by authorities to confirm his death, a decision that drew international attention and criticism. His killing removed the central figure holding the Beltrán Leyva organization together. Without his leadership, the group fragmented rapidly into smaller factions, accelerating internal conflict and weakening its ability to control territory. Power, money, and fear kept these drug kingpins alive until it didn't. Watch our other kingpin videos to see their stories.